On January 23, 1963, at approximately 6:15 p.m., a man walked into a third-floor apartment on Rue Cantari in Beirut, carrying a manila folder that would dismantle a 30-year friendship. His name was Nicholas Elliott. He was 46 years old. And inside that folder were decrypted Soviet communications, witness statements from 3 separate defectors, and a timeline documenting how his closest friend had betrayed British intelligence since 1934. By the time Elliott left that apartment 4 hours later, Kim Philby would have confessed to being a Soviet agent, and Elliott would have made the decision that would allow his best friend to escape to Moscow rather than face trial in London. Philby was 51 years old. He had been Elliott's colleague at MI6 for more than 2 decades, and the evidence Elliott carried proved that every operation they had worked on together, every secret Philby had been trusted with, every confidence they had shared had been systematically transmitted to handlers in Moscow. Nicholas Elliott and Kim Philby met in 1940 at the Secret Intelligence Service training facility outside London. 2 young men in their early 20s who had both been recruited to MI6 during the early stages of the Second World War. Elliott came from a diplomatic family. His father had served as a colonial administrator. Philby was the son of Harry St. John Philby, a famous Arabist and explorer. Both men had attended Cambridge, though at different times, and both had been identified by MI6 recruiters as promising candidates for intelligence work based on their social connections, their language skills, and their ability to operate comfortably in the upper reaches of British society. Their careers moved in parallel through the war years and into the Cold War. Philby worked in the Iberian section, then counterintelligence. Elliott specialized in operations against Soviet targets. By 1949, Philby had been posted to Washington as MI6's liaison to the CIA and FBI, a position of extraordinary trust and access. Elliott served in various European posts. They saw each other when Philby returned to London, meeting at clubs in St. James's, sharing dinners with their wives, comparing notes on the frustrations and victories of intelligence work. According to multiple MI6 officers who worked with both men during the 1940s and 1950s, Elliott considered Philby not just a colleague, but his closest friend in the service. They had the kind of relationship built on shared danger during the war, mutual respect for each other's capabilities, and the particular intimacy that develops between people who cannot discuss their actual work with anyone outside a small circle. Philby was charming, intelligent, and seemed destined for the highest levels of MI6 leadership. Elliott trusted him completely. So did nearly everyone else in British intelligence who knew him. But on June 1st, 1934, 6 years before Nicholas Elliott would ever meet Kim Philby, a man named Arnold Deutsch approached Philby in Regent's Park and recruited him to work for Soviet intelligence. Deutsch was an Austrian who operated in London undercover as a university lecturer. He worked for the NKVD, the Soviet intelligence service that would later become the KGB. And he had been watching Philby for months, studying his background, his connections, his ideological sympathies developed during his time at Cambridge. Philby had been a member of the Cambridge University Socialist Society. He had attended communist study groups. He had traveled to Vienna in 1933 and married a communist activist named Litzy Friedman. By most accounts, he genuinely believed in the communist cause, convinced that the Soviet Union represented humanity's best hope against fascism and that helping Soviet intelligence was morally justified given the failures of British and European governments to confront Hitler's rise. The recruitment meeting lasted approximately 2 hours. Deutsch later filed a report with Moscow describing Philby as intelligent, committed, and operationally promising. Philby accepted the assignment immediately. He was 22 years old. The instructions Deutsch gave him were straightforward, but would require years of disciplined execution. Philby was to distance himself publicly from communist politics. He was to cultivate a persona as a conventional, even conservative member of the British establishment. He was to build connections with people who could help him enter government service, particularly the Foreign Office or intelligence services. And he was to wait for further instructions while establishing himself as someone with access to information Moscow wanted. Philby followed these instructions methodically. He joined the Anglo-German Fellowship in 1934, an organization sympathetic to Nazi Germany, specifically to create the impression that his earlier communist sympathies had been a youthful phase he had outgrown. He worked as a journalist covering the Spanish Civil War, carefully presenting himself as anti-communist in his reporting. He married again to Aileen Furse in 1940, further establishing conventional credentials, and he began cultivating relationships with people in British government circles who might recommend him for positions that required security clearances. The strategy worked. In 1940, Philby was recruited into the Secret Intelligence Service based on recommendations from contacts who knew him as a talented, patriotic young man with valuable language skills and foreign experience. The person who had screened him for MI6 had no idea that Philby had been working for Soviet intelligence for 6 years, that every step of his professional development had been designed to position him for exactly this opportunity, or that his recruitment into British intelligence represented the successful completion of one of the most patient and sophisticated penetration operations Soviet intelligence had ever conducted. By the time Philby entered MI6 in 1940, he had been working for Soviet intelligence for 6 years, and every friendship he would build, every confidence he would gain, every secret he would learn would be systematically transmitted to his handlers in Moscow. The relationship with Nicholas Elliott, which would begin that same year at the training facility outside London, was part of that systematic exploitation from the very start. The first indication that MI6 had been penetrated by Soviet intelligence came in 1945, when a Soviet defector named Igor Guzenko provided information to Canadian authorities suggesting that the NKVD had recruited agents from Cambridge University in the 1930s. Guzenko had been a cipher clerk at the Soviet embassy in Ottawa. He brought with him documents showing that Soviet intelligence had run extensive operations targeting British institutions. The information was fragmentary, but it included references to recruitment of young men from elite universities who had then positioned themselves for government service. MI6 took the information seriously, but had no specific names to investigate. The description could have applied to dozens of people who had been at Cambridge during the 1930s and were now working in various branches of government. The matter was noted, filed, and marked for ongoing attention, but no immediate action was taken because there was insufficient evidence to justify investigating specific individuals. Over the next 6 years, a pattern began to emerge that would eventually lead investigators back to Guzenko's warnings. Operations were failing. Intelligence being passed to trusted allies was showing up in Soviet hands. Sources were being arrested or disappearing. The failures were sporadic enough that they could be attributed to the normal risks of intelligence work, but frequent enough that counterintelligence officers began looking for commonalities in who had known what before operations were compromised. In 1949, American and British cryptographers working on the Venona project, an effort to decrypt Soviet intelligence communications from the 1940s, began identifying references to agents operating within Western intelligence services. The decrypts were incomplete, filled with code names rather than real identities, but they confirmed what the pattern of failures had suggested. Soviet intelligence had penetrated British and American services at high levels, multiple sources, long-term operations, systematic compromise of classified information. Philby, by this time, was in Washington serving as MI6's senior liaison to American intelligence. He had access to joint British-American operations. He attended meetings with CIA counterintelligence chief James Jesus Angleton. He was briefed on FBI investigations into Soviet espionage. He was trusted completely by both services, and he was in a position to know about nearly every significant Western intelligence operation being conducted against Soviet targets. According to declassified American intelligence assessments from this period, some CIA officers found Philby's questions unusually detailed, his interest in operational specifics sometimes excessive. But these observations were not acted upon because Philby was Britain's official liaison, and asking detailed questions was literally his job. On May 25, 1951, two British diplomats, Guy Burgess and Donald Maclean, disappeared from England. 5 days later, they surfaced in Moscow, having defected to the Soviet Union. Both men had been under investigation for possible espionage. Maclean had worked in the British Embassy in Washington and had access to classified Anglo-American intelligence sharing. Burgess had worked for MI6 before transferring to the Foreign Office. The defection created immediate crisis within MI6 and MI5, Britain's domestic security service. How had both men known they were under investigation in time to escape? Who had warned them? The question became more urgent when investigators discovered that Burgess and Philby had been close friends at Cambridge, had remained in contact throughout their careers, and that Burgess had been staying at Philby's home in Washington in the weeks before the defection. Philby was recalled from Washington in June 1951. He was interrogated by MI6 officers over a period of several weeks. According to the classified interrogation reports, he was asked specifically whether he had warned Maclean that he was under investigation. Philby denied it. He acknowledged his friendship with Burgess, but characterized it as a personal relationship unrelated to their professional work. He expressed surprise and dismay at the defection. He offered full cooperation with the investigation. The interrogators found his answers plausible but unsatisfying. There were inconsistencies in his account of the final weeks before the defection. His explanation for why Burgess had been staying with him seemed rehearsed, but there was no direct evidence connecting him to the warning that had allowed Maclean to escape, and British intelligence had no physical proof of espionage activity. What MI6 did have was institutional suspicion and a growing conviction among some officers that Philby's proximity to too many compromised operations could not be coincidental. The decision was made to force his resignation while the investigation continued. In July 1951, Philby was dismissed from MI6, though no charges were filed and no public announcement was made. He was 39 years old. His career in British intelligence appeared to be over. Nicholas Elliott, who had been posted to Vienna at the time of Philby's recall, defended his friend vigorously. According to colleagues who witnessed Elliott's reaction, he was adamant that the allegations against Philby were based on circumstantial evidence and guilt by association. He argued that forcing out one of MI6's most capable officers over suspicion rather than proof was unjust and operationally damaging. Elliott's defense of Philby was noted in his personnel file, but did not affect his own standing within the service. Philby, after his dismissal, worked as a journalist in the Middle East. He maintained contact with former MI6 colleagues, including Elliott. He cultivated the image of a man wrongly accused, professionally destroyed by paranoid counterintelligence officers who had mistaken bad luck for betrayal. Some in MI6 believed him. Others remained suspicious, but had no new evidence to pursue. The suspicion remained dormant until 1961, when a KGB officer named Anatoly Golitsyn defected to the CIA in Helsinki. Golitsyn had worked in the KGB's counterintelligence directorate and had access to information about Soviet penetration of Western intelligence services. During his debriefing, he provided specific details about a Soviet agent who had operated within MI6, who had been part of a Cambridge recruitment network and who had warned Guy McLean before his defection in 1951. Golitsyn's information did not include Philby's name. Soviet intelligence used elaborate security procedures that kept agent identities compartmented even within the KGB, but the operational details Golitsyn described matched what investigators knew about the Burgess and McLean case. The agent Golitsyn described had to have been someone with access to the investigation of McLean in early 1951, someone in a position to communicate with both Burgess and McLean quickly, someone trusted enough by MI6 that his presence in sensitive positions had not raised immediate red flags. MI6 reopened the Philby investigation in late 1961. This time, the inquiry was more systematic. Investigators compiled a complete timeline of Philby's career against a timeline of compromised operations. They reviewed every posting he had held, every operation he had known about, every source whose identity he could have learned. They compared this timeline against Soviet intelligence successes and Western intelligence failures. The pattern that emerged was devastating. Nearly every operation Philby had known about had been compromised. Sources he had been briefed on had been arrested. Operations he had helped plan had failed. The correlation was not absolute, but it was statistically significant far beyond what chance would explain. Nicholas Elliott, by this time, had risen to a senior position within MI6. He was read into the renewed investigation in early 1962. According to his later testimony to internal investigators, reviewing the evidence was one of the most difficult professional experiences of his career. Each compromised operation represented not just intelligence failure, but human cost. Agents arrested, sources executed, operations years in development destroyed because someone on the inside had systematically warned Moscow. Elliott spent months examining the files. He cross-referenced Philby's access against Soviet responses. He studied reports from defectors going back to 1945. He reviewed the 1951 interrogation, transcripts, and compared them against what was now known. The details Golitsyn had provided about the agent who warned McLean matched Philby's access and timeline precisely. The operational pattern across 17 years of Soviet penetration pointed to someone with exactly Philby's career trajectory. There were specific cases that stood out in Elliott's review. In 1949, MI6 and the CIA had planned an operation to infiltrate anti-communist guerrillas into Albania to destabilize the communist government. Philby had been briefed on the operation in detail as part of his liaison role. Every team sent into Albania had been captured or killed within days of insertion, suggesting that Albanian security forces had been waiting for them. Dozens of men had died. In 1945, a Soviet intelligence officer named Konstantin Volkov had attempted to defect to British intelligence in Istanbul. Volkov had offered to identify Soviet agents operating within British intelligence, including one who served in counterintelligence. Philby, working in the counterintelligence section at the time, had been assigned to handle the case. Before arrangements could be finalized, Volkov disappeared. He was later confirmed to have been forcibly returned to Moscow and executed. According to the case files Elliott reviewed, Philby had been the only MI6 officer with complete knowledge of Volkov's defection attempt and its timing. There were more. Operations in Eastern Europe where agents had been arrested immediately after Philby was briefed on their activities. Counterintelligence operations against Soviet intelligence officers in London that had failed when targets seemed to know they were under surveillance. Joint Anglo-American operations where the Soviet response suggested advanced knowledge of Western planning. Elliott created his own chronological log, documenting each case against Philby's access. He noted when Philby would have learned specific information. He noted when corresponding Soviet actions occurred. He documented the pattern in a notebook he kept locked in his office safe. adding entries as he reviewed more files. He thought about Philby's behavior over the years. The questions Philby had asked that had seemed merely thorough at the time, but in retrospect seemed designed to extract specific operational details. The times Philby had sought information about cases he had no operational need to know about. His friendship with Burgess, which Elliot had dismissed as personal eccentricity, now appeared as part of a support network among Soviet agents. He thought about his own interactions with Philby, the dinners where they had discussed cases, the conversations where Elliot had shared frustrations about investigations or mentioned source names he was working with, the casual intelligence exchange between trusted colleagues that is the currency of liaison relationships. Every confidence he had shared with Philby over 20 years of friendship had potentially been transmitted to Moscow. He thought about whether their friendship had been genuine or whether Philby had cultivated the relationship deliberately, recognizing that Elliot's trust would provide access to information Elliot held or could obtain. He wondered if every drink they had shared, every conversation they had had, every moment of apparent intimacy had been calculated manipulation designed to exploit Elliot's loyalty and his willingness to trust a friend. The mathematical accumulation of evidence forced Elliot to a conclusion he had resisted for more than a decade. Philby had been working for Soviet intelligence since before entering MI6. He had systematically betrayed every operation he had access to. He had caused the deaths of dozens of agents. He had compromised Western intelligence capabilities for an entire generation. And he had done it while maintaining friendships with the men he was betraying, including Elliot himself, exploiting their trust as ruthlessly as he exploited their classified information. By December 1962, Elliot had compiled what he believed was sufficient evidence to confront Philby directly, though not sufficient to prosecute him in court without exposing intelligence sources and methods that MI6 could not compromise. The decision was made at the highest levels of MI6 to attempt to obtain a confession. If Philby could be convinced to cooperate, to provide details about his recruitment, his handling, his contacts, the confession would have intelligence value even if it never led to prosecution. And the person chosen to extract that confession was Nicholas Elliot, because MI6 leadership believed that the personal bond between Elliot and Philby represented the best chance of getting Philby to admit what interrogation had failed to extract in 1951. What Elliot was grappling with during those final weeks of 1962, according to his later interviews with MI6 investigators, was not whether to confront Philby, but how to do it in a way that would extract the truth from a man who had been lying professionally for 30 years. The standard interrogation approach had failed in 1951. Philby had been questioned by experienced MI6 officers, had faced the evidence calmly, and had provided explanations that were impossible to disprove without revealing sources. He had training in resisting interrogation. He understood intelligence tradecraft. He would recognize standard pressure techniques and would respond with practiced denials or calculated admissions that revealed nothing of operational value. Elliot's advantage, if it could be called that, was the personal relationship. Philby might lie to MI6 interrogators, but confronted by his closest friend, someone who had defended him, someone who had trusted him completely, he might feel sufficient guilt or respect or simple human connection to admit what he had done. That was the theory MI6 leadership was operating on when they authorized Elliot to travel to Beirut. Use the friendship as leverage. Extract a confession by making the lie personal rather than professional. Elliot prepared methodically. He reviewed the evidence again, organizing it into a sequence that would be impossible for Philby to explain away. He memorized the operational details so he could present them without notes, making the confrontation feel like a conversation between friends rather than a formal interrogation. He considered what Philby's responses might be and how he would counter them. He thought about what he wanted to achieve beyond simple confession: names of handlers, details about communication methods, information about other Soviet agents still operating within British intelligence. He thought about the impossibility of what he was being asked to do: to confront his closest friend with evidence of comprehensive betrayal, to use their friendship instrumentally as a tool to extract intelligence, to maintain enough emotional control during the confrontation that Philby would talk rather than simply refuse to engage. He thought about what he would do if Philby confessed. MI6 had not given him clear instructions about detention. There were legal complications about arresting a British citizen in Lebanon without coordinating with Lebanese authorities. There were diplomatic sensitivities about acknowledging that a senior MI6 officer had been a Soviet spy for 3 decades. The assumption seemed to be that Elliot would obtain a confession and then arrangements would be made for Philby's return to Britain, but those arrangements were vague, and Elliot understood that vagueness was deliberate. On January 10, 1963, Elliot boarded a flight to Beirut, carrying a folder of evidence and the understanding that he was about to either confirm his friendship had been genuine despite everything, or discover that he had been exploited for 30 years by someone who had never valued the relationship beyond its intelligence utility. On January 23, 1963, at approximately 6:15 p.m., Elliot knocked on the door of Philby's apartment at Rue Kentari in Beirut, and Philby opened it with a drink already in his hand. The apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building near the American University. It had high ceilings, tile floors, and windows that overlooked the street. Philby had been living there since 1956, working as a correspondent for The Observer and The Economist, covering Middle Eastern politics while maintaining informal contact with MI6 officers who passed through Beirut. He offered Elliot a drink. Elliot accepted. They sat in chairs facing each other across a low table. For the first 20 minutes, according to Elliot's report filed 3 days later, they discussed mutual acquaintances and regional politics. Philby asked about Elliot's family. Elliot asked about Philby's work. The conversation had the rhythms of old friends catching up after time apart, which was exactly what both men were performing until Elliot placed the folder on the table between them. He opened it and began presenting the evidence systematically: the compromised operations, the timeline of Soviet responses corresponding to Philby's access, the defector testimony, the pattern spanning 3 decades. He laid out each piece methodically, watching Philby's face, giving him opportunities to explain or deny. Philby did not deny it. He listened to each point Elliot made. He sipped his drink. He asked clarifying questions about specific operations, not whether he had betrayed them, but about details of how they had failed. When Elliot finished presenting the evidence, Philby was silent for several minutes. Then he confessed. He confirmed he had been recruited by Soviet intelligence in 1934. He acknowledged that he had warned McLean in 1951. He admitted that he had systematically compromised British and American operations throughout his career. He provided names of his Soviet handlers, though not names of other agents. He described communication methods he had used, dead drops and scheduled meetings and coded messages, with the clinical precision of someone discussing work he had done competently. What Philby did not provide, according to Elliot's report, was justification or remorse. He did not explain his ideological motivations beyond brief references to believing the Soviet cause was just. He did not apologize. He did not ask for Elliot's understanding or forgiveness. He simply confirmed what the evidence had already established and answered the specific operational questions Elliot posed. The conversation lasted approximately 4 hours. By the time Elliot left the apartment at 10:30 p.m., he had obtained a confession that confirmed 30 years of espionage, but had not obtained the comprehensive debriefing MI6 had hoped for, and he had not made arrangements for Philby's detention because neither man had explicitly discussed what would happen next. 6 days later, On January 29th, 1963, Kim Philby disappeared from Beirut. He had been scheduled to meet with Elliot again that afternoon to continue their discussions. Elliot arrived at the apartment at the agreed time and found it empty. Philby's belongings were still there. There were no signs of struggle or hurried departure. He had simply not returned from wherever he had gone the previous evening. Elliot reported the absence to MI6 headquarters immediately. Within hours, British intelligence officers in Beirut began checking hotels, contacting known associates, reviewing recent movements. Lebanese authorities were notified quietly. Port authorities were asked to review manifests for departures in the previous 24 hours. Airport records were examined. What investigators discovered was that Philby had boarded a Soviet freighter called the Dolmatova on the evening of January 28th. The ship had departed Beirut harbor at approximately 11 p.m., bound for Odessa. By the time MI6 confirmed Philby's departure, the Dolmatova was in international waters beyond the reach of any interdiction. According to MI6's internal investigation, completed in March 1963, Philby had been under KGB surveillance since Elliot's arrival in Beirut. Soviet intelligence had assessed that Elliot's visit represented a significant threat to their asset and had activated an emergency extraction protocol. A handler had met with Philby on January 27th and provided instructions for departure. Philby had left his apartment on the evening of January 28th, ostensibly for dinner, and had proceeded directly to the waterfront where the Dolmatova was docked. The investigation focused particular attention on Elliot's handling of the confrontation. Why had Philby been left free to move around Beirut after confessing? Why had no arrangements been made for his detention or surveillance? Why had Elliot not coordinated with Lebanese authorities to restrict Philby's movements while awaiting instructions from London? Elliot's position, documented in his formal statement to the investigation, was that he had believed Philby would cooperate voluntarily and that premature detention would have terminated the debriefing process before useful intelligence could be extracted. He maintained that MI6 headquarters had not provided clear instructions about detention procedures and that the expectation had been that he would conduct multiple conversations with Philby over several days before arrangements were finalized. The debate within MI6 about whether Elliot had been professionally negligent or whether the escape represented a calculated Soviet intelligence operation that would have succeeded regardless of Elliot's actions continued for months. No disciplinary action was taken against Elliot, but his judgment in handling the confrontation was questioned internally, and some officers believed he had allowed personal loyalty to compromise operational security. The official British government announcement that Philby had defected to the Soviet Union came on July 1, 1963. By that time, Philby had been in Moscow for 5 months, and Soviet intelligence had already debriefed him extensively about British operations and personnel. In Moscow, Philby was given Soviet citizenship, an apartment on Pushkin Square, a KGB pension, and a position as advisor to the First Chief Directorate. But according to KGB officers who later defected to the West, he was also given something he had not anticipated: isolation from the society he had spent 30 years serving. The Soviet authorities treated him with ceremonial respect but practical suspicion. He was a defector, regardless of his decades of service, and defectors were inherently unreliable in the calculus of Soviet intelligence. He was assigned a KGB minder who monitored his movements and associations. He was not permitted to work on active operations beyond providing historical debriefings about British intelligence organization and personnel. He was given a comfortable life, but not the meaningful work he had expected as reward for his sacrifice. His Russian language skills, despite his father's expertise in the region, were limited. He could manage basic conversation, but struggled with the nuance and idiom necessary for genuine social integration. He attended functions at the KGB Club. He gave occasional lectures on Western intelligence methods. He wrote articles for Soviet publications about the failures of British imperialism. But according to Oleg Gordievsky, a KGB officer who defected in 1985 and who had observed Philby in Moscow, he was profoundly lonely, drinking heavily, caught between the British establishment he had betrayed and the Soviet system that would never fully accept him as one of their own. He married 4 times. His third wife, Eleanor, whom he had married in Beirut, followed him to Moscow but left after discovering he had been conducting an affair. His fourth wife, Rufina, was a Russian woman who provided companionship during his final years. He published a memoir in 1968 titled My Silent War, justifying his espionage as ideological commitment to a cause he believed was historically inevitable and morally necessary. By the 1970s, his value to Soviet intelligence had diminished to ceremonial appearances and propaganda utility. He was trotted out occasionally for interviews with Western journalists, where he defended his choices and criticized British intelligence methods. But he had no operational role, no access to current intelligence, no purpose beyond serving as living evidence that the KGB could recruit and run agents at the highest levels of Western services. Nicholas Elliott continued working for MI6 after the Philby case, though his career was marked by the failure in Beirut in ways that were never formally acknowledged but were understood throughout the service. He was not disciplined, he was not dismissed, but he was also not given positions requiring the same level of trust that had characterized his earlier career. He served in various postings through the 1960s and into the 1970s, competent and professional, but no longer considered for the highest levels of leadership. According to colleagues who worked with Elliott during this period, he rarely discussed Philby except when operationally necessary. He did not defend his handling of the Beirut confrontation. He did not apologize for it. He maintained that he had obtained a confession, which was what MI6 had asked him to do, and that Philby's escape represented a Soviet intelligence operation that had been in place regardless of Elliott's actions. He retired from MI6 in 1975 at age 58. He gave occasional interviews to journalists and historians researching the Philby case, providing factual accounts of events but rarely discussing his personal feelings about the betrayal. In one interview conducted in 1986, he acknowledged that Philby had been his closest friend and that discovering the extent of the deception had been professionally and personally devastating, but he did not elaborate beyond that statement. Both men lived with the consequences of that January evening in Beirut for the rest of their lives. Philby, in an exile he had chosen, but perhaps not fully understood, and Elliott, with knowledge that his friendship had been exploited as part of the longest-running intelligence penetration operation either service had conducted. Kim Philby died in Moscow on May 11, 1988, at age 76 from heart failure, and was buried with full KGB honors at Kuntsevo Cemetery. The Soviet Union awarded him the Order of Lenin posthumously for his contributions to Soviet intelligence. His funeral was attended by senior KGB officers and Soviet officials who praised his dedication to the communist cause and his success in penetrating British intelligence for 3 decades. Nicholas Elliott died on February 8, 1994, at age 77 in England. His funeral was private, attended by family and former MI6 colleagues. The service made no mention of Philby or the Beirut confrontation. He was remembered by those who spoke as a capable intelligence officer who had served Britain during the Second World War and throughout the Cold War. The full accounting of damage caused by Philby's espionage emerged gradually through declassified assessments and historical research conducted after the end of the Cold War. According to MI6 and CIA damage assessments completed in the 1990s, Philby compromised virtually every significant operation he had access to during his career. He passed more than 900 documents to Soviet intelligence. He identified dozens of Western intelligence officers operating in Soviet territory or working with Soviet sources, information that led to arrests and executions. The Albanian operation, which attempted to infiltrate anti-communist resistance fighters into Albania between 1949 and 1952, resulted in the deaths of approximately 300 men, all of whom were captured or killed because Soviet intelligence had warned Albanian authorities about the operation based on information Philby provided. The Volkov defection case in 1945 resulted in Volkov's execution after Philby alerted his handlers that a KGB officer was attempting to provide information to British intelligence. Operations that Philby had compromised included joint Anglo-American efforts to support anti-Soviet resistance movements in Ukraine, Georgia, and the Baltic states in the late 1940s and early 1950s. According to declassified CIA assessments, teams of agents parachuted into Soviet territory were often captured within hours of landing, suggesting that Soviet security forces had been positioned exactly where the drops would occur. Philby had known the locations, the timing, and the identities of the agents being inserted. In the case of the Volkov defection, documents declassified in the 1990s revealed that Philby had delayed processing Volkov's defection request for several days in 1945, claiming administrative complications, while he alerted his Soviet handlers that a KGB officer was attempting to provide information to MI6. By the time British intelligence officers arrived in Istanbul to finalize arrangements, Volkov had been drugged, wrapped in a carpet, and transported back to Moscow on a Soviet diplomatic flight. He was executed shortly after arrival. The damage assessment extended beyond specific operations to broader strategic impact. Philby's access to joint Anglo-American intelligence planning during his Washington posting from 1949 to 1951 meant that Soviet intelligence had detailed knowledge of Western capabilities, priorities, and gaps in coverage. This intelligence allowed Soviet services to adjust their own operations, protect their sources, and exploit Western weaknesses in ways that shaped the intelligence competition throughout the early Cold War. British intelligence operations against Soviet targets in Western Europe during the 1940s and 1950s were systematically compromised because Philby knew which Soviet intelligence officers were under surveillance, which communication channels were being monitored, and which recruitment operations were underway. According to MI6's internal damage assessment, the service effectively had no operational security against Soviet counterintelligence during the entire period. Philby was active because he could warn Moscow about any operation that threatened Soviet interests.